Our lesson this morning may seem redundant. It may seem that I'm dwelling too much on particular aspects of our lesson, but I think it's important that we understand that at the cross there were miracles that were performed when Jesus died. There were miracles that were performed before Jesus died at the cross. And skeptics down through time have tried to disprove the legitimacy not only of Jesus Christ, but also the accuracy of the cross, the accuracy of the scriptures, the gospels, as they tell us what occurred there at the cross. This morning we pick up our lesson once again at the 6th hour, when darkness had covered the land. The synoptic gospels, all three, speak of the darkness that covered the land during this particular moment, the 6th hour, as the scriptures tell us. But ironically, since we had our last study on this on April the 8th, 2024, as I'm sure all of you know, a total solar eclipse passed through Mexico and the United States and Canada. And this was the first solar eclipse in these parts since 2017. A total solar eclipse lasts about 2.5 to 4.5 minutes. And the recent eclipse lasted, I understand, around 4 minutes and 28 seconds at the peak of the eclipse. Only those areas directly in the path received that total eclipse. In areas such as us, we only received what is called a partial eclipse. In biblical times, human societies were frightened and overwhelmed by eclipses, thinking that some great and unknown force, such as God or an evil spirit, was at work. For ancient Israelites, God created the sun and the moon and set them in the sky. And he separated light from darkness on the fourth day of creation, as we read in Genesis, the first chapter, the 14th to the 19th verse. Therefore, only God could interrupt those normal expected cycles of nature and produce something such as a solar eclipse, a darkening of the sun, which was a very unusual event. Especially a total eclipse for them was a cause for alarm and fear. The prophet Amos in particular saw the solar eclipse as an omen of punishment to the Israelites for disregarding their ethical responsibilities, especially to help the needy and the poor. And he wrote, "Shall not the earth shake for this? On that day declares God. I will make the sun set at noon, and I will darken the earth on a sunny day." Amos 8 through 9. This was also a foretelling of what would happen on the day that Jesus was crucified, when the earth became dark as well. But similarly, Jeremiah describes omens in the sky in Jeremiah 10 and 2. And Isaiah describes the day of Andoi. Andoi means Lord, that is coming with God's wrath, that the sun shall be dark when it rises and the moon shall diffuse no glow. Isaiah 13, 9 through 10. Certain of these biblical authors clearly saw these eclipses as terrifying interruptions in the natural order of nature. The Babylonians, I understand through historians, believed that eclipses were also omens. And according to historians, the Babylonians had created a method of forecasting eclipse or partial eclipse. And they believed that eclipses could foretell the death of a king. And they would use a ruse to try to disrupt the death of a king by using a double for the king during an eclipse. And I'm told, and some believe this is just a folklore, but it is told that the Babylonians told of a king who died while during an eclipse, while his double was on the throne. So the double assumed the throne after this particular king died, and he just remained on the throne. Now, whether that's true or not, the Babylonians did believe that eclipses were omens. They didn't have at that particular time the insight that we do today of how eclipses occur. All they could see was that the sun had been darkened. The Talmud's view of solar eclipses, and consistently in the Talmud, a solar eclipse is considered, or was considered, a bad omen for all humanity. It reads, "The sages taught, When the sun is eclipsed, it is a bad omen for the entire world. Earlier in the same section of the Talmud, Rabbi Meir, a 2nd century AD rabbi, is quoted as saying, when the heavenly lights, the sun and the moon are eclipsed, it is a bad omen for the enemies of the Jewish people. But he also said it is a bad omen for the Jewish people as well. In a later section, the ancient rabbis speculated that the causes of the eclipse could include disregard for the honor of a rabbi following his death, ignoring the cries of an engaged woman being attacked, the forgeries of documents, and note this particular one, people who brought false testimony to court. Know how ironic that is. We know the Jews brought false testimony against Jesus Christ in his trials. A lunar eclipse, on the other hand, is directed to the enemies of the Jewish people. Since our calendar is based on, and their calendar was based on a cycle of the moon, the location of the eclipse, the color of the sky, the time of the day of the eclipse, foretold of whom the eclipse was a bad omen for. Was the darkness of the crucifixion merely a common eclipse? I would venture to say most, if not all of us here today, have never really questioned the scriptures, never really questioned the scriptures or the synoptic gospel where it talks about the darkness came over all the land as reported. Now, while this question has been posed by many people from many different contexts and many different ways, we want to confront the reasoning of some who deny any supernatural descriptions of biblical events. This type of blatant denial of any supernatural elements is only a ploy toward the ultimate denial of God and his power. Rather, we consider the historical events and the blending of God's supernatural power with God's establishment of physical laws a part of his ability, a part of his power. We find a full account that helps us in the scriptures. We find this full account that helps us both not only investigate and describe the power under consideration here today, but to understand the unique events depicted in the scriptures. And you may ask, why are we spending so much time on this particular aspect of the crucifixion? The critics of the crucifixion and the divinity of Jesus Christ use every aspect. They try to disprove that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that even in his death on the cross, that the miracles did not occur. And there are so many that happened, and we're not going to go into all of those today, but in this particular case where darkness came over all the land was an intervention by God. It wasn't a total solar eclipse as we know it today, but it was by the hand of God that we will see here in just a moment. There are many paths we could take with these discussions, for there are many skeptics of not only who Jesus was, that he actually died on the cross, but the miracles, as we mentioned, that occurred while he was on the cross and at his death. As an overview, here's the timeline of the crucifixions. According to Mark 15 and 25, Jesus was crucified at the third hour of the Jewish day, around 9 a.m., which is the initial placement of Jesus on the cross. Then at the sixth hour, that's 12 p.m. noon, there came darkness over all the land for a duration of 3 hours until the ninth hour, or 3 p.m. Matthew 27:45, Mark 15:33, and Luke 23 and 44 all talk about this event. At this point, Jesus cried out 3 of his recorded sayings on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15 and 34. And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Luke 23 and 46. And it is finished. John 19 and 30. At the point of Jesus' death, the darkness appears to have ended, as each account describes the darkness lasting 3 hours, then Jesus giving his life. Without getting into the minute detail, these are the key points why the darkness was not either a solar eclipse, a lunar eclipse, or even a recent theory that the darkness was due to another non-supernatural cause called a Karashim dust storm. Let's address this dust storm first. People in the United States in the 1930s could certainly relate to what a Karashim dust storm was, because on April the 14th, 1935, referred to as Black Sunday, a particularly severe dust storm hit the Dust Bowl in the United States. It was one of the worst dust storms in American history, and it caused immense economic and agricultural damage. The people had no doubt it was a dust storm. People who witnessed it and recorded it reported that they saw this cloud of dust coming for miles. Birds flying in front of it as fast as they could to try to escape the fury of it, and the smaller birds finally giving out and falling to the ground, where they were suffocated as with many animals did, and also some humans. The dust permeated everything, every crack within a house. And I'm told that the survivors of that particular storm said that dust was everywhere in their home, in the cabinets, everywhere that they could be. They breathed and ate dust. You know, there are many effects of such a dust storm, one of which is suffocation. Anyone caught out in the open during one of these would potentially perish, certainly. A Karashim dust storm, also known as Black Sikoro, which is a natural occurrence in the Middle Eastern countries. A dust storm with sufficient intensity could certainly hide the sun for a period of time and create the illusion of nighttime. However, this theory really doesn't hold water, or dust, as it were. If a dust storm of this intensity had descended upon Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion, onlookers, including friend and foe of Jesus, would have known exactly what it was, and it would have been recorded that way by the Gospels. Later accounts in the Gospel do not mention such an intense storm event or dust storm event. The extent of the darkness, all three synoptic gospel writers agree the darkness covered all the land. Matthew 27 and 45, the whole land. Mark 15 and 33, and all the earth. But we also have testimony of a Greek historian writing in 137 AD, stated that in AD 33, the world was gripped by the greatest eclipse of the sun. Now we have to understand, as we mentioned a moment ago, their thought of the eclipse of the sun was no more than what they saw. They didn't understand all the things that really could affect that eclipse. But further he wrote, it became night in the 6th hour of the day, so that the stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things overturned in Nicaea. Both of these places are in northwest Asia Minor. His testimony was later cited by Africanus and Origen, and as we will observe more momentarily, we can be sure that the darkness at the crucifixion, which took place on the 14th of a lunar month, was not a solar eclipse. At that time, the moon is full. Thus it is on the far side of the earth, not between the earth and the sun. While we must dismiss this Greek philosopher's testimony of it being an eclipse, we can, however, accept his testimony as to what the people observed, and that the darkness did not obscure the stars. And the dramatic and magnificent events that occurred beginning at the 6th hour through Jesus' death convinced the commanding Roman officer, a Roman soldier attending Jesus' death, such that he proclaimed truly this was the Son of God, recorded in Matthew 27 and 54. If the darkness was caused by dust being blown around, even to the extent of one of these magnificent dust storms, there's no doubt in my mind that it would have had an effect on this Roman soldier's opinion of the crucifixion, because it was something that could easily be described or easily be explained if it was merely a dust storm. But also such a dust storm would have driven away many of the spectators. And we know the scriptures tell us that there are many there at the cross that are, the scriptures say, are wagging their heads. They are throwing insults at Jesus. But we know that if there had been such a dust storm, it would have driven those spectators away. I think we can safely conclude that the darkness was not caused by a massive dust storm, as some skeptics like to say. The solar eclipses really have a narrow path of that total eclipse. They have a dramatic period of darkness, certainly. This period of darkness lasts a maximum, as we said before, of approximately 7 minutes in total. The most recent being just over 4 minutes. And the total darkness at the cross lasted, as the scriptures confirm, for 3 hours. Jesus' trial and crucifixion happened near the feast of the Passover, which occurs every year in the same month, and the same day of the month, according to Leviticus 23:5. The Passover began on the evening of the 14th day of the last month. This is an important fact in that the counting of the Jewish time is based on a lunar calendar, which each month follows the lunar cycle beginning on the new moon. And this connection can be seen by the Hebrew word often translated as month, which is Kodesh, which originates from a root meaning new. The crucifixion of Jesus happened near the middle of the month at Passover, and the phase of the moon was near a full moon instead of a new moon, which is the complete opposite of a solar eclipse. The time of the month dispels the possibility of a solar eclipse as we know it, or as a solar eclipse is defined. The duration of the darkness provides also additional evidence that the darkness that covered the land was a supernatural event created by God himself. Only God has the power to change the physical laws of nature, which is what occurred. The Bible describes a 3-hour time frame for the darkness, as we've already mentioned in Mark 15 and 33. And considering a solar eclipse, the entire event can really, I understand, last approximately 3 hours from the duration of when it actually begins until the end. However, this period includes that entire process from the point when the moon begins to cover the moon. And if you've ever watched a solar eclipse, you know that it's a very gradual process as it goes through it. The moon begins to cover the sun until the moon finally completes its course in front of the sun. This is a gradual process of slowly dimming to a point of maximum eclipse, then slowly brightening to maximum brightening once again. This gradual dimming does not match the distinct descriptions of the darkness over the land that the Bible describes. The total darkness, the maximum duration of darkness in that solar eclipse, as we have already mentioned, being 7 minutes, and the 3 hours that the scriptures mentions that the sun was darkened. As an example, the total eclipse in 2017 lasted a maximum of 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And as we've already mentioned, the one that we recently had was just a little over 4 minutes. Have you really ever thought about what the significance of that darkness was? Why did God darken the sun for 3 hours? You know, it seems out of character to suggest darkness may represent the presence of God, because God is always characterized as light versus Satan as sin and darkness. However, in Exodus 20 and 21, Moses, the writer, says the people stood afar off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And in 1 Kings 8 and 12, then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick darkness." This darkness of the windowless inner sanctuary is identified with a dark storm cloud over Mount Horeb at the giving of the law, Exodus 20 and 18, and Psalms 18, 10 and 11. We also know in the scriptures that the 9th plague sent by God upon Egypt was a judgment against Pharaoh for not letting God's people go. We read in Exodus 10, 21 through 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light where they lived. a darkness to be felt. You know, that's hard to imagine that it was that dark, that you could almost feel the darkness. And people did not rise. Their lights did not penetrate this darkness. If we draw a parallel between this darkness of the Egyptians and the darkness at the cross, there are some distinct differences and there's some similarities as well. Both were supernatural events that only God had the power to defy the laws of nature and set in motion these miraculous events. The darkness at the cross, I don't believe, was the type of darkness spoken of in Exodus, but it was total darkness. We know that there must have been enough light to allow the soldier to offer Jesus a drink when he said, "I thirst." But both of these events ended in the death of a firstborn son. We know Pharaoh would not let God's people go, so the firstborn of all Egyptians, their cattle, and so on were slain. When Jesus' death on the cross was finally complete, the darkness was lifted as a result of his conquering of the darkness of sin. The darkness of the cross was foretold by Amos during the reign of Jeroboam, somewhere around the middle of the 8th century BC. Amos 8:9-11. And on that day declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feast into mourning and all your songs into lamentations. I will bring sackcloth on every waist and baldness on every head. I will make it like the mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. The darkening of the sky started at the 6th hour we've already touched on. And traditionally the Passover lamb was slaughtered in the afternoon on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which would have been around the time of the earth was dark and Jesus was entering his last 3 hours of this physical life. This is significant for the 6th hour or noontime, coinciding with the very moment that the high priest Caiaphas, arrayed in his priestly garments, began the procession in which he would enter the temple courts to slaughter a pure, spotless Passover lamb. It is likely that a great number of unblemished lambs were slaughtered in the temple courts during those hours of darkness. One lamb slaughtered for every household in Israel, unless the household was too small, as we know. The supernatural darkness that covered the land lasted until the 9th hour, about the time when the sacrifices of the Passover lambs will be coming to an end. The symbolic parallels between Jesus as a sacrificial Lamb of God and the Passover lamb are profound. It was the moment that Jesus cried out, "It is finished," John 19:30. Jesus must have been so exhausted. And as he heaved upward to breathe that last time in this physical body, Jesus gathered enough air to speak forth a victory shout that no other in ancient history to come. Matthew 27:50 tells us that he yielded up the ghost. Matthew tells us next is simply amazing. He writes, "And behold, the veil of the temple is rent in twain from the top to the bottom." I'm told the word behold is a Greek word adou, A-D-O-U, and that it is a difficult word to translate. It's a difficult word for me to pronounce, for it carries such intense feeling and emotion. The King James Version most often translates this word as behold. But to put it in our modern language, I believe it could very well read, Matthew is saying, wow. Wow, what just happened? Matthew wrote about this event many years after its occurrence, but he was still in awe. He was still awestruck by what had happened. The renting or tearing of the veil was significant. Not only the fact was it torn by the hand of God, but also that it meant what it meant from a spiritual perspective. In Hebrews 9:1-9, the writer tells us that in the temple a veil separated the Holy of Holies, the earthly dwelling place. The earthly dwelling place of God's presence from the rest of the temple where men dwelt. This signified that man was separated from God by sin, Isaiah 59:1-2. And only the high priest was permitted to pass beyond this veil once each year, Exodus 30:10 and also Hebrews 9 and 7, to enter God's presence for all Israel and make atonement for their sins, Leviticus 16. I understand this veil was massive. Solomon's temple was 30 cubits high, 1 Kings 6 and 2. But Herod had increased the height to 40 cubits, according to the writings of Josephus, a first century Jewish historian. This would have made the veil somewhere near 60 feet high. An early Jewish tradition says that the veil was about 4 inches thick. Some other writers say it was an inch thick. But whether it was 4 or an inch or somewhere in between, we understand that this represented a massive piece of cloth. And Joseph also wrote that horses tied to each side could not pull the veil apart. Yet at the moment of Jesus' death, Mark 15, 37 through 38 tells us, and Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up the ghost, and the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to bottom. Imagine the scene as that occurred. This massive veil in the temple, a thick and heavy curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. It depicted a significant and symbolic barrier between God and humanity, but imagine the sound as that tore. Imagine the sound as that huge piece of cloth was torn in two. But as Jesus breathed his last breath on the cross, suddenly there was a great earthquake. The ground shakes, and at that moment the veil of the temple tears in two from top to bottom. But just picture that scene as it occurs. The mighty hand of God ripped it apart, revealing the innermost sanctuary of the temple. The tearing of the veil symbolized several things: the opening of access to God for all people through Jesus Christ's sacrifice, the end of the old covenant, and the beginning of a new era of direct relationship between God and humanity. It's a powerful, dramatic moment in the gospel narratives, capturing the significance of Jesus' death and the profound changes that it brought forth. But the size and thickness of the veil make the events occurring at the moment of Jesus' death on the cross so much more momentous. No human hand could have torn this massive veil. No earthly event could have caused the tear, as some skeptics say that the earthquake that occurred rent that huge cloth. But we know that the temple was still standing. And I don't know that there is any earthquake that could have ripped that big cloth in two. But this dramatically symbolized that Jesus' sacrifice, the shedding of his own blood, was an atonement for sins for all time. It signified that now the way to the Holy of Holies was open for all people, for all time, both Jew and Gentile. God would never again dwell in temples made with human hands, Acts 17 and 24. In Matthew 25 and 51 is the only gospel that mentions the earth shaking. Well, why was Matthew the only one that mentioned the earth shaking? Some speculate that Matthew's account was pure hyperbole, or he made it up to add dramatic effect to the significance of Jesus' death. I believe Matthew intended for his readers to understand the impact of Jesus' death. No doubt, the power of a living God whose only Son was cruelly crucified, and what Jesus' death meant. I believe he intended for the scene to be taken as plain historical fact, though. Matthew goes to great lengths to emphasize how those surrounding details in this scene had eyewitnesses. The centurion and others saw and felt the earthquake and everything else that occurred, Matthew 27 and 54. I understand through historians that an earthquake occurred in approximately 31 BC, and this was written about by Josephus, the Jewish historian. He described the earthquake as a significant social and economic event during King Herod's reign. But there was a second earthquake as recorded by geologists and reported on in the Geological Society, occurred about 31 BC quakeline, and it was dated around 31 AD or plus or minus 5 years. But history specifies that it was 31 AD. It is estimated that that earthquake was on the scale of 6 which would have certainly shaken the buildings. It would have shaken the earth, and people would have certainly known the earth was shaking. The word earth is the word GES, which describes the whole earth. The word quake is the Greek word seso, which means to shake or agitate or to create a commotion. It's where we get the word seismograph, the apparatus that we know is used to register the intensity of earthquakes. You know, it's interesting to note that Origen, the early Christian leader, recorded there were great quakes at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And we know through the scriptures that the tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints that who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of Man, born to a virgin mother, a carpenter's son, who grew in stature with God and man, who came to earth with a specific mission for God, whose life and death were foretold by the prophets of hundreds of years before, who taught the good news. He performed many miracles, raising some from the dead, causing the blind to see and the lame to walk. He prayed so intensely before his arrest that this cup that he was about to bear would pass from him. And he prayed so intensely that it's recorded in the scriptures that his sweat was as great drops of blood. We know that he endured the mock trials, the beatings, the humiliation, the shame, the agony of the cross. And after 6 long agonizing hours nailed to that rugged beam, he gathered his last breath, his last ounce of strength in his earthly body, and proclaimed it is finished. And he gave up his spirit. And I want you to pay close attention to the word gave. Man, even though they had the power to abuse Jesus' earthly body, his physical body, they did not have the power to put him on the cross nor take his life. Jesus, that the scripture might be fulfilled, freely gave his life. After he had fulfilled his mission on earth and the prophecies were fulfilled, Jesus Christ gave up his life. We're going to end our lesson this morning, and we'll pick that lesson up again. And yes, there's 3 parts, I'm sorry. We'll pick it up as Jesus' body is taken down from the cross. And we'll proceed through the resurrection in our next part. But I hope that through these series of lessons, and I know that much of it is redundant. Brother Etienne gave a very good lesson just recently that covered many of these points. But I hope that through these lessons that I'm giving, that we can understand and we can give an answer of the power that was represented there on that hill that day. The power of God was represented there that day. The power of Jesus Christ was represented there that day. His resolve to finish his task, to finish what he started, what God had asked him to do. And when that was finished, he gave up his life. But not until then. Not until he had finished his course did he give up the ghost. This morning, brothers and sisters, this lesson is yours. And I ask you, how often do you think about the crucifixion? How often do you contemplate what was sacrificed for you? Through God's grace, he's given us all an opportunity this morning to come to him if we haven't obeyed the gospel. He's given us that opportunity at this point in time. He's also given those that have taken those steps and allowed themselves to be separated from our Lord to make things right. we want to offer you that opportunity. But I also want to say to you that whatever hour of the night that it may be, that you come to the realization that you need to become a child of God, or you need to confess your sins, there are brothers that are willing and able to make those things, to pray with you and for you. You don't have to wait till Sunday morning to do that, to come down this aisle. You can do that with a phone call, or we can come to wherever you might be while we stand and sing.
If you like this sermon, do 3 things for me. Give it a thumbs up below, click the subscribe button, and share it with a friend either on social media or text. This helps the channel grow. It helps the word get out there. It's something really easy that you can do to affect the spreading of the gospel. This has been the Chapel Grove Church of Christ. Visit our website at chapelgrovechurch.com. We'll see you next time.